Shake on the Jope. Not Diop. Not Diop. This is Jope. Literally spent was studying and teaching and lecturing right up until the moment he died. Theophilo Baker, Asa Hilliard, Ivan Van Sertima, many others that have been named and can be named. And yet if you take the sum total of knowledge of all the people who have dedicated their lives to the reclamation of the history of people of African descent, they've only scratched the surface. You simply have no idea of the depth and the breadth of it. Because the history of African people isn't just the history of people of Africa in Africa. There was a sense in which at one time in the world, the whole world was Africa. Now what do I mean by that? We'll just take a small portion of that when we're talking about what anthropologists call anatomically modern human beings. Human beings exactly like you and me. Let's not even talk about the hominids who for 7 million years, through a process of evolution, lead up to anatomically modern human beings. We're just talking about modern human beings like you and me. Been on this planet 300,000 years. In Africa first. They don't leave Africa in any significant degree until 100,000 years ago. They don't start changing into the subvarieties of the original human species until 40,000 years ago. So that means for 260,000 years, 90%, 85–90% of human history is a history of black people. The pyramid rises to a height of 481.5 feet. It is built of 2.7 million blocks of stone. The smallest stone is 2.5 tons, and the largest stone is somewhere between 70 and 100 tons. If you were to take the intact masonry of the Great Pyramid, by the way, can you hear me in the back? I don't want you to miss any of this. If you could take all of the intact masonry of the Great Pyramid and cut it up into 1-foot blocks, you could build a wall that would circle 2/3 of the globe. And you know they built it without even using the wheel? They used to float 1,000-ton blocks of granite from Aswan 500 miles down the river, and they can't even do that today. The pyramid was oriented precisely to the 4 cardinal points. The base of the pyramid, the side of each base of the pyramid was 755 feet, 6 inches, with an average error of 1/10,000th. The casing stones that covered the pyramid were so finely jointed that you could not and cannot insert a piece of your hair in between the joints, even today, where they are still in existence. The area of the base of the pyramid is 13 acres. But it's real interesting. If you look at the height of the pyramid, it is, if you measure it, it is the radius of a circle that you can create by turning the base of the square base of the pyramid into a circle. And therefore you can find the square base by the area of the perimeter of the square base by 2 pi r. So that means they had built the constant, the geometric constant of pi, into the pyramid. The descending passage was precisely aligned to the North Pole star that was in place 3,350 years BC, which only, and it used to shine down to the grotto and into a pool of water. And of course, it's only in that place once every 26,000 years. The so-called ventilating shaft of the King's Chamber oriented exactly to Orion in the southern heavens, and the one from the Queen's Chamber is oriented exactly to Sirius, also in the southern heaven. There has never been anything like it in the world. Nothing. Do you know the other thing about the Great Pyramid? Where the Great Pyramid sits, if you were to take all the longitude, there are 360 degrees of longitude around the Earth, right? The longitude of the Great Pyramid goes through more landmass than any other longitude in the world. The latitude of the Great Pyramid going right through the Great Pyramid, goes through more latitudinal landmass than any other latitude in the world. So the Great Pyramid, from the point of view of land, is the center of the earth. This is the reason why that not only in Egypt, but in Greece, Rome, Palestine, India, and China, build their cities in fixed intervals to the Great Pyramid. The Great Pyramid was the prime meridian. The prime meridian we got now going through Greenwich, England, is a complete artifact. It's not based on anything. The original prime meridian was the Great Pyramid. Next slide, please. Okay. And so that if you look at every inhabitable continent, apart from the Western Hemisphere, even that's not quite as, that might even be one. The first people on each of the major inhabited continents are people of African descent. Like, that's the reason why I say we were, really still are, though we don't have the consciousness of it, a world people. And there was a sense that the world was Africa, and Africa was the world. In fact, until the world humanity, all 7 billion people, come to terms with that fact, there will be no peace on earth. Because it is just happened that Africa, Africans are the parents of humanity. Just want you to look at these. Because you see these are so-called Aurignacian Venuses. This is a so-called Khoisan woman, which people call the Bushman, but we call Khoisan or the Batwa, from Southern Africa, Namibia, South Africa, Botswana. And look at her compared to the Aurignacian Venuses. These Aurignacian Venuses go back 40,000 years. And they're not in Africa, they're in Europe, in Central Asia, in Siberia. These are what the first Europeans looked like. And these show you that the people living there venerated, more than venerated, that their preoccupation was on the power and divinity of the female as mother and producer of life. Because notice, and we'll come back to these, that what we call the secondary sexual characteristics are accentuated. Breasts, buttocks, etc. Because these emphasize both her life-giving capacity and her nurturing capacity. Even today, black men don't mind too much if black women have a little bit of something here and there. Baby got back! In Job's model, the northern cradle was geographically defined as Europe, Central Asia, and Northeast Asia. The southern cradle is Africa, India, and Southern Asia. The zone of confluence would be the Eastern Mediterranean. Zone of confluence means where they kind of met and then began to merge in some way. It would be the Eastern Mediterranean, Mesopotamia, and Iran, or Persia. In Job's view, by the way, the first Persian civilization was a black civilization. It was called Elam, and its capital was Susa. You know, did everyone see that movie, The 300 with the Spartans?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you know, even though they kind of made him a little strange, remember the Persian king was black. That was actually accurate. I mean, they made him look a little bizarre, acting bizarre, but the fact of it was true. Okay? All right. In Job's view, a sustained conflict developed between the cultures of the northern and southern cradles, mostly played out in the zone of confluence. This conflict is revealed in the waves of Aryan population thrusts eastward into India around 1700 BC. That's when it began, about that time, or a little later maybe. And westward into Greece, 1200 BC. The first of these waves to assault Egypt as the Sea Peoples was repulsed by Ramesses III in 1190 BC. Next slide, please. Khemsit, Mentuhotep's queen, 11th dynasty, 2300 BC. Now Mentuhotep, the 11th dynasty, 11th and 12th dynasty constitute what we call the Middle Kingdom. All of the pharaohs of the 11th dynasty, or the Middle Kingdom, 11th and 12th dynasty, are descended from a woman of Taseti, which means that they're descended from a Nubian. Now, Herodotus said that there were 18 Ethiopian kings that sat on the throne of Egypt. You have to figure, about 9 or 10 of these came from the Middle Kingdom. And this is one of the queens of the Middle Kingdom. Next slide, please. Nefertari, founder of the 18th dynasty, the most celebrated individual in ancient Egyptian history by the Egyptians themselves. In fact, she is, after her death, she was actually venerated as a goddess. And because she is considered the founder of the 18th dynasty. This is about 1600 BC. Next slide. These will be kind of, we'll move along on these. They're mostly images and photos. Hatshepsut as a Sphinx, 18th dynasty, 1505 BC. There were 4 women that sat on Egypt's throne as pharaohs. Not as queens, but as pharaohs. Hatshepsut was by far the most powerful, the most dynamic, and the most celebrated. And 18th dynasty. And her reign was a period of unmatched prosperity and peace in ancient Egyptian history. Next slide, please. Hatshepsut's daughter Nefertari, sitting with her prime minister Senenmut. Senenmut was her architect and prime minister. He was her right-hand man, so to speak, and he was also what we call her morganatic husband. What does that mean when we say morganatic husband? If you have a royal person who marries a person of non-royal ancestry, if that's a morganatic relationship, neither the spouse, the non-royal spouse, nor the spouse's children from that spouse inherit the royal, or not royal. They're never considered royal. So that's why they call him morganatic. Okay? So even though he was her husband, he could never aspire to royalty. Hatshepsut's temple, Deir el-Bahari. I know that those of you who've been to Kemet have seen this. It's the most unusual temple maybe in the world, cut out of living solid rock. There is no freestanding pillars in this temple. It's like, just imagine that you had the cliff like that, like that. Imagine that this is here, and you just started carving the temple out of the cliff. That's what they did under Senenmut, Hatshepsut's prime minister. Dedicated to Hathor. Yes, sir. This is actually on the temple of Deir el-Bahari, on the back wall of the temple that we just saw. This is the Queen of Punt. Punt would have been in what is now the Horn of Africa, Somalia, Ethiopia. And ancient Egyptians were always sending expeditions to Punt. And sometimes they would come back in diplomatic emissaries, and sometimes the queen herself. And you know she's an African queen. I mean, it's kind of, you can't look at her and think of her being anything else. So these are 2 queens meeting in Kemet. Next slide, please. Queen Tia, the mother of Akhenaten, the most prominent and powerful female, or really person, in the reign of Amenhotep III and Amenhotep IV. Okay? And it is her who was supposed to have actually launched what they call the Amarna Revolution. That is, Akhenaten was the one who promulgated the worship of Aton singly and exclusively. The first really historical example that we know of what we think of as exclusive monotheism. But Aton, the worship of Aton, was first pushed forward by his mother, Queen Tia. Next slide, please. I show this because, very often people say, well, the Egyptians were black, how come you see them painted red like this? Well, first of all, you saw earlier when we saw the children, the Maasai girls, painted red, and they have a natural coppery, reddish coloring anyway. So, you see, people have been in Africa for 300,000 years. So, they have a range of tints and tones and skin colors that are still native to Africa. And they can even be in the same country with those ranges, same ethnic grouping, sometimes even the same family, without it meaning, with them still being native. Next slide. Imhotep, if he had done nothing else in the world but designed and built this temple complex, his fame would be indelible and assured. But beyond that, he was even more renowned as a physician. I'm sorry Dr. Watkins had to leave, because if he didn't already know it, and he already might, It is in ancient Cam, 6,000 years ago, that the first systematic studies of cardiovascular circulation and cardiovascular physiology began. There is something called the Edwin Smith Surgical Papyrus, about 6,000 years old, which I call the founding document of scientific medicine, in which are described the heart as the center of the circulatory system, the major vessels going out of the heart and into the periphery and into the vital organs, the movement of blood out of the heart, the phenomenon of pulsation that occurs as a result of the movement of blood outside the heart, the measuring of the pulse itself, which Hippocrates, by the way, did not do, the understanding a relationship between the heart and the lung, heart and the kidneys, and even the heart and the liver. The physicians in the room know what I mean when I talk about passive congestion of the liver as a result of congestive heart failure. Ancient Egyptians described that. They described angina pectoris. They even described Stokes-Adams attacks. What is a Stokes-Adams attack? Some people can get heart dysrhythmias. Those dysrhythmias cause a slowing down of blood to the brain, and the person can pass out. Simply put, the ancient Egyptians describe that not only in the not in the Edwin Smith Papyrus, but in the Ebers Papyrus. So that cardiovascular physiology and cardiovascular pathology and cardiovascular medicine begins in Africa 6,000 years ago. And I think Johns Hopkins is one of the world's centers of cardiovascular medicine, if I'm not mistaken. Don't even know they owe a debt to ancient black people living on the Nile 6,000 years ago. What we said about cardiovascular physiology also applies to anatomy. It is in ancient Egypt, 6,000 years ago, that you had the first systematic studies of anatomy, the first anatomy textbooks, the first anatomy anatomical lexicon. This is the skull, the external skull, and all the topographical landmarks of the skull are demarcated in a technical language. This is one of the things that is fascinating about the Edwin Smith Surgical Papyrus. It is the first technical language, technical and scientific language in the world. This is the interior portion of the cranium, which was described by the ancient Kamites. I might just mention that they described the results of what happens to injuries to the temporal portion of the brain. The physicians in the room know that in the front part of the temporal portion of the brain is Broca's area, controlling articulate speech. Behind Broca is Wernicke's area, controlling processing and understanding of sounds and language. You get a lesion or an injury to the Broca's area, you get expressive aphasia. To Wernicke's area, it is receptive aphasia. Expressive aphasia means you slur your words. Receptive aphasia means that you can't understand what's being said to you, so you speak in meaningless babble. With the ancient Egyptians, and by the way, an injury to both, you can get injury to both, which is total or mixed aphasia. The ancient Egyptians describing this in the Edwin Smith Papyrus. So they have not only described the sort of macro surface of the brain, they had described the cortical functions of certain areas of the brain nearly 4,000 years before Broca's experiments 120 years ago, 130 years ago. This is case number 31 in the Edwin Smith Surgical Papyrus, a vertebral dislocation. What is absolutely amazing about this is that the ancient Kamites describe the neurological, in medicine we say sequela, side effects or effects of this particular type of injury or insult, including paraplegia, quadriplegia, priapism, genital urinary incontinence, what they call missio seminis, the inability to control the secretion of semen. All this is described in the Edwin Smith Surgical Papyrus. Now you have to understand, about 50 years ago, not even that long ago, about 30 years ago, a physician was looking at all this and he was saying, you know, today, as we speak, it would be difficult. See, one of the things you have to appreciate as a physician, that here they're able to relate a specific insult or injury or problem to a complex series of pathological outcomes. Now, this caused one physician to comment. He said, it would be difficult for us to make all these connections and correlations today without benefit of x-rays. So the question arises, how did our black African presuppositions of 6,000 years ago do so. They used to strain the virus. They used to heat the virus. They actually used to attenuate the virus. When I say the virus, they used to get samples, pustule samples from someone who was affected by smallpox and then inoculate it with a pinprick into unaffected individuals. But apparently, in some cultures, they used to actually do something to the virus to actually weaken its effect. So it wouldn't give you the disease, it would only give you the immune response. So here we have a people in so-called darkest Africa understanding the concepts of contagion, immunity, and vaccination. Hundreds of years before they became operative scientific concepts in European medicine with Pasteur and Koch.
You know, it's literally whitewashing the ancient Egyptians, taking when you make a mistake, when you're typing something out and you make a mistake and you get some white out and you just white it out. That's what has been done to the history of black people, African people worldwide. It has been whited out, especially when it comes to Kemet, especially when it comes to Egypt. Why? Because Egyptologists as a group, not all of them, want Egypt desperately. They want it. They want it more than they want Greece or Rome. Why? Because everything that is Greek or Roman is ultimately, or let's not even just that, ancient Hebrew, for that matter, Assyrian, anything that you can name in that part of the world. But let's just stick with Greco-Roman, is ultimately comes from the Nile Valley. Name something, I will show you its Nile Valley antecedents. Math, science, philosophy, religion, mythology, symbolism, it all comes from ancient Egypt, and the Greeks knew it. The Greeks were very proud of themselves, you know. They were very chauvinistic, very proud of themselves, and they had a kind of a superiority complex about every other people except two people, the Egyptians and the Ethiopians.
Logic, arithmetic, astronomy, geometry, and music, what we call the 7 liberal arts. This was the educational system that was in place at the time that Greek people came to Kemet.
Now go back and show who the people were that established this.
Okay, the people, the
images that you showed earlier.
Okay, the images that we're showing are these people. See, now I just skipped back to the 12th dynasty, but in this dynasty, these people were teaching trigonometry. In other words, we have papyri with math problems on them, the Rhine papyrus, the Moscow papyrus, with problems on them. These papyri were written in the 12th dynasty, and they had problems not only in geometry, but also in trigonometry. That just gives you an example of how highly developed mathematics was.
So that.
This is problem number 51, which gives you the formula for finding the area of a triangle, 1/2 base times height. So this is relatively basic geometry. Next slide, please. But problem number 56 is something else. Problem number 56, let me see if I can, actually, it might be better if I put my glasses on and actually read this a little bit. Yes. Problem number 56 in the Rin mathematical papyrus, that's the one you see up there, seeks to find the slope of a pyramid whose height is 250 cubits and whose base is 360 cubits. The answer is 5 1/25 palms for each cubit in height, representing the cotangent of the angle of the slope of the pyramid's face. Now, if you've got a cotangent, if you can find cotangents, you know the way you can find tangents is that you flip the cotangent over. It's the inverse of a tangent. The other thing, too, just look at that. Imagine that pyramid is three-dimensional, because that's what it's supposed to be. Now, all you really have to do is inscribe a triangle inside that pyramid, a right triangle whose height is also the same as the height of the pyramid. Therefore, the face becomes the hypotenuse, and half of the pyramid's base becomes the base of that right triangle, and then the height of the pyramid becomes the height of the right triangle. When you you have all that in place, and it's really just a matter of drawing it in, you then can find sine and cosine. So now, if they have the tangent and cotangent and the ability to find sine and cosine, by definition, they have trigonometry. Now, the reason why I make that point is because every historian of science tells you that trigonometry wasn't invented until Hipparchus did 1,500 years later. Now, you see, we're not just talking about rudimentary calculation. We are now moving into the realm of higher mathematics, the foundation of all mathematics. Next slide, please. These are various kinds of surgery practiced in traditional Africa, particularly in East Africa. We won't dwell too long. These are various East African surgical instruments. In particular, I want you to pay attention to the implement on the right, the burning iron, the cautery iron, because it becomes important right about now. As I say, my pièce de résistance, my crowning glory. I won't say mine, but since I'm presenting it, I call it mine. Because if there's any single, if someone said, Dr. Finch, show one slide to make your entire point, it would be this one, of all the ones that I've shown. R.W. Falcon, a medical missionary traveling in Uganda in 1879, interested in traditional obstetrics, came upon this scene in a village in the Banyoro Kingdom of Uganda and was allowed to witness it. Woman, 20 years old, first pregnancy, in labor 3 days without progress. 3 men, one holding her abdomen, the other holding her stomach, and the other, as you see the surgeon, poised with a knife. Mutters an incantation, takes banana wine, alcohol, washes his hands with it, washes the abdomen with it, then proceeds to cut her from the xiphoid process down to the pubis symphysis in what today is called a classical incision. Takes the cautery irons one by one, slitting off the bleeding points, opens up the peritoneum, opens up the uterus, takes out the baby, cuts the cord, clamps it, hands the infant to an assistant, then seals off the bleeding points again with the cautery iron that I showed you, turns the woman over on her side so the amniotic fluid would spill out, turns her back on her back, takes his fingers and goes inside the uterus and dilates the cervix from within. Now, the obstetricians and gynecologists in the room know what the significance of that is. You have to do that in order to let postpartum blood escape. Again, sealing off the bleeding points with red-hot cautery irons, then closing the uterus and the abdomen with 7 sharp spikes. Falcon observed mother and child for 11 days. The mother had 2 days of fever, which disappeared, and after 11 days, mother and child were alive and well. An elective cesarean section like this, elective, was not even done routinely in Europe until 20 years later. As Falcon himself said, Lister, the so-called founder of modern antiseptic surgery, his team could hardly have performed with greater smoothness. Falcon's informants say this was custom among their peoples, that when a woman could not push a baby out, they would hand her over to the surgeon. This has been going on for generations. This was no fluke. In fact, Falcon says you couldn't get this level of coordination and professionalism and surgical skill without a tried and true operation that had been going on for a long time. The surgeon obviously understood the concepts of anesthesia, antisepsis. He used wine, that is alcohol, to clean the surface and his hands, and hemorrhage control. Now, the anesthesia is the most confusing part, because the only thing that they will say is that Falcon noticed, I should say, is that she was given a concoction of banana wine. But the only time she made a noise is when the surgeon introduced the knife at the beginning. She made a little noise in her throat, and then for the rest of the operation, she did not utter a sound, even though she was awake. So there was something else in that concoction than just grog. I don't even rule out the possibility there may have been, shall we say, psychogenic or hypnotic factors involved. You know, the neurologists in the room and the psychiatrists in the room, people like Pat Newton and others know about endorphins, et cetera, et cetera. These are the biochemical substances within the body, created by the body, that cause anesthesia, that are released by things such as acupuncture. I'm speculating a little bit here, but I mean, I think all of this is a worthy speculation. The point is that this is a landmark, not merely in African surgery, this is a landmark in surgery, in a place at that time which was being called Darkest Africa. Had surgical technique that Europe had not, or America had not even achieved up to that time. You can see why, if I have to use one slide out of the 180 slides I have on African medicine, I would choose this one and this one alone. Okay, let me, that in itself is a long and intense discussion, but let me just throw a fact at you that may, in sum it up. There has been work by a demographic historian, Louise Myers-Jope. She's a demographic historian on Africa in particular. She has determined that at 1500 AD, 8 years after Columbus blundered on America, but 1500 AD, the population of the continent of Africa was at a bare minimum 600 million people. By 1900 AD, 400 years later, that population was 100 million. It was a holocaust of unimaginable proportions.